Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Duke Think Global Seminar Series. We have a fantastic talk in store. It's called Decolonization Approaches to Global South and North Partnerships. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being a part of our learning journey. And I want to say a huge thanks to my co-presenters for today. First, we have Ms. Amandari Kanagaratnam, who was a MPH Masters of Public Health student at George Washington University during the time of this work that we're going to share with you. And congrats to Amandari, who has now graduated and will be talking about experiences from her perspective. My other fantastic co-presenter is Dr. Rhoda Wanyenze, who is a world-renowned infectious disease physician, a really fantastic global health scholar, and of course is Dean of the School of Public Health at Makerere University in Uganda. Now, some of you might know me. I am Dr. Allysha Maragh-Bass. I am an adjunct professor at the Duke Global Health Institute, and I am a scientist too at FHI 360, right down the street from Duke. Once again, thank you all and welcome. So a couple things. First off, here's the overview for our session. The purpose of the session today is to share key findings and reflections from a recently published white paper that my colleagues that I mentioned and others worked on decolonization, localization, and diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility. And we're reflecting on the field and the development of actors in both global North and South spaces. We will talk about all of these topics, we will define these terms, and there will also be time for Q&A. So first off, we'll do some of those introductions and give a little background context for everyone. Then we'll have a lightning presentation. My colleagues Amandari and Rhoda will also present and share about the process we undertook and also lessons learned. Then we open the space to you all. We hope to have an open, honest, candid conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll briefly close the space after that. Let's get started, folks. First off, to do this work with transparency, we believe in starting with introductory statements, but also giving some background context. The first piece of context we'd like to give is called a positionality statement. These are statements that reflect our own worldview, our socio-political context and orientation. My colleagues and I all wrote them back actually when we did this white paper, and I've shared them here with you all. I'll also invite my colleagues to state their own positionality and statement. So Amandari, do you want to start us off talking about your positionality? Thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Amandari. So this is my positionality statement. I am a mixed race, Sri Lankan, Singaporean, Irish American, able-bodied, cisgender, heterosexual woman. I was born in the US and raised in China. I'm a native English speaker. I'm multilingual, and I am an MPH Master of Public Health graduate from a private US university.
Thank you so much. Dr. Wanyenze, can you share your positionality with us?
Thanks, Allysha, and hi, everyone. I'm a medical doctor and a professor, as well as dean for the School of Public Health in Makerere University. I have worked in many partnerships, including wide networks of partners within Africa. I have worked on a number of projects, both as the prime recipient organization as well as a sub-recipient. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rhoda. So with regard to my own positionality, I do have a much longer statement. Some of you have seen it. But the interest of brevity, I'll say that I'm a first-generation American. I identify as an Afro-Jamaican or Black Jamaican-American woman. I am cisgender, heterosexual, and able-bodied. I'm a scientist first and foremost, and I am a professor. I'm native English speaking, but I also speak multiple languages. Thank you all to my co-presenters. And now let me walk you all through a little bit more background context now that we've established our positionality. We threw out a lot of terms already at you, haven't we? So I already mentioned DEIA, colonialism, positionality. We're going to walk through all of them. First things first, especially those of us who might be from countries in the global North, we've heard of diversity, equity, and inclusion at this point. we intentionally are introducing the term diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Now, the reason is because one of our key partners in this work, which we'll talk about, was the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID for short. They are very intentional about using the term DEIA and specifically working on fostering a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion for those living with disabilities as well as those who do not. And that's where the accessibility piece comes in. Ultimately, if we think about what DEIA is, it's really when an organization is taking part in multi-level and really transformative efforts to create and foster an accepting, open, respectful, transparent, fair, and just workplace. Now, it is usually internal facing. In other words, organizations are looking at their own hiring practices, salary equity, parity, looking at professional development opportunities, etc. It's usually internal facing. Hope that makes sense. And I'm hoping that it's somewhat a familiar term for folks. Another term we talk about quite a bit is colonialism, and that is the practice of domination and or subjugation of one people to another through the transfer of settler populations, which ultimately is at the expense of indigenous knowledge, culture, religion, and language. Many of us lived in territories and currently live in territories that have been colonized, and it has everything to do with removal of language and culture and ways of being and doing and knowing. And that is the process that colonialism was. That historical context is what we're all kind of living in. We've already talked about positionality, but just to define it again, it's socio-political context that creates your identity, your worldview, and ultimately how you move through the world. If we're going to talk about colonialism, of course, we have to talk about decolonization, and that is the process of dismantling the harmful legacy of colonialism and bringing back, repatriating indigenous land, culture, knowledge, ways of being, expertise, language, all of those pieces that were there all along, but have been subjugated or attempted to be erased. Lastly, localization may not be a term that's familiar for everyone, but essentially, along with the need for decolonization and DEIA, many organizations, especially international non-governmental organizations like my own, FHI 360, they talk about localizing. And that ultimately is the process of changing policies, processes, staffing, funding, and other resources to shift power and resources back to global South actors. That has everything to do with strengthening local systems and facilitating local leadership. If that term is not familiar, potentially you might have heard the term locally led development. Those are very much sibling terms. They're very interconnected to each other. You will hear us use these terms throughout the talk, so we hoped that if we started with some shared understanding, it would make understanding the rest of what we have to say clearer. Now, some of you may have seen this image on the right, or excuse me, on the left-hand side. I cannot take credit for it. It was created by Madhu Pai, who was actually one of the presenters at Duke's Global Health Symposium, Decolonizing Global Health Symposium a couple years ago. I was also one of the presenters. Highly recommend looking at the recording if you have not seen it. But what the image represents and what we hope to convey today is that DEIA, localization, decolonization, challenging and undoing white supremacy, challenging racism, patriarchy, all of those systems, they are interconnected to each other. And we do our work in a blind way if we are not looking at, acknowledging, and leveraging those connections to upend all of these systems of oppression. That's what the image conveys, and that's what we hope to talk about today. Now, we've already talked through some of the key terms. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see a couple of key concepts that we wanted to make sure that we convey. First off, similar to decolonization, DEIA has everything to do with undoing power imbalances that result in very systematic exclusion and underrepresentation. It's not random how we've gotten to a lack of diversity, equity, inclusion. It's not random why we need to decolonize. So we want to make that case explicitly. The second point we want to call out is that localization should result in indigenous local communities having independent funding and direction, for them to decide their own destinies, to prioritize their own needs and where they allocate resources and create programs. So if you are truly localizing by design, that must result in DEIA. There has to be equity, inclusion, accessibility, and diversity. You can't truly localize unless you've done that. So again, this is why we say these are connected concepts. Lastly, we believe transformative DEIA is not only necessary, but it is a sibling to both decolonization and localization, because decolonization is about transforming the entire sector. Localization is about transforming the leadership role of communities. And ultimately, all of this moves forward when we have long-term investment, accountability, and resource allocation. Now, we've gotten some key information out of the way. One other thing I want to point out is some of the context behind not only the work that we did, but work we're all doing. If folks did not see this opinion piece in the New York Times last February, I highly recommend it. If you all have seen me speak before, you know I talk about it a lot. It really synthesizes the work that needs to be done and the context that we're all in a beautiful way. It's called Foreign Aid is Having a Reckoning. And it's about how the Black Lives Matter movement and atrocities like the George Floyd murder have reignited passion and awareness of these issues we've known about for a very, very long time. I want to call out the subtitle here. See how it says Black Lives Matter movement has given leaders from the global South traction for change? This is truly a global conversation. The power imbalances and power dynamics that have resulted in exclusion and inequities and lack of diversity, they absolutely play themselves out in places like the global North and the United States and internationally and globally. It is very much a shared conversation, and all of us are in that space where we're recognizing that global health and development need change, and change is absolutely happening. So like I said, highly recommend this piece if you did not see it. We've now given you all quite a bit of context and background to understand how we're coming in the space today to share the work that we've done. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Amandari, who can tell you a little bit more about that work. Thank you.
You can start on the next slide, please, Allysha. All right, so we're going to be going over this white paper that we worked together on, titled Decolonization, Localization, and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Accessibility in Global Health and Development, a Call to Action. So in this presentation, we're going to go over how the work began, the goals and the process of the white paper, what we learned both from stakeholders and in our partnership, and how it has progressed since the very beginning. Next slide, please. So how did this work begin? It was born out of an existing consortium of partners on the USAID funded project called Research for Scalable Solutions, or R4S. This is a project that conducts implementation science research to improve the efficacy, cost effectiveness, and equity of family planning in Africa and Asia. And the partners in that project include Evidence for Sustainable Human Development, or EVIDAF, the Makerere University School of Public Health, Family Health International, FHI 360, and USAID. And so from internal dialogue with these partners led to concept note development, which then led to funding and collaboration with USAID for this white paper. Next slide, please. So the goal of the white paper was to spark discussion, raise awareness, and identify action steps to address historic power imbalances that continue to shape the field of global health and development for actors in both the global North and global South. And so in order to achieve this, we examine how decolonization, localization, and DEIA intersect and differ, and how they serve as foundations for effecting change. And so, as you might have noticed on this slide, we have certain terms in quotes, and this was part of the process was creating a glossary of problematic terms in global health and development. Some of them had alternatives. Actually, they all had alternatives, but in the paper, we did use some common terms, but put them in quotes to signify that they were problematic, because it was important for us to be mindful of the power of the language that we use. Other key features of the process were the positionality statements. All of the authors on the paper had positionality statements that start off the paper. And we also reflected openly in the paper challenges and lessons that we learned in producing it. Next slide, please. So this is a short screenshot of the table of problematic terms that I just mentioned. We also did define and explain in sort of more words why some of these terms are problematic in the text of the paper. But this sort of serves as a guide to think about what terms are problematic and consider using other terms. Next slide, please. So what was the process of the white paper? We conducted case summaries and analysis for enacting the work of decolonizing global health from the perspectives of the authors and stakeholders who served as key informants to guide the work. So each of the organizations that worked on the white paper identified stakeholders that they felt were appropriate for these discussions. There were 21 interviews in all, and the interviews lasted between 30 to 90 minutes. We came up with a list of questions that address the historical context of global health and development, the stakeholders' personal experiences of power imbalance between the global north and global south in their own work, their perspectives on decolonization, localization, and DEIA, and actionable next steps that the stakeholders thought would be possible. And we specifically asked about the role of funders in supporting change. And the questions were also translated into French for use with French-speaking colleagues based in Francophone countries in Africa. Next slide, please. Okay, and now I'm going to pass it over to Rhoda to talk about findings.
Thank you, Amandari. I will share with you a summary of the findings that we synthesized from the feedback from the stakeholders that we interviewed across the participating. One of the first issues here is the definition of a local partner. This is an issue that recurred in several of our interviews about the definition being NGOs to register as local partners, and resulting into a situation where there is perhaps a change of name, but not necessarily a change of the institutions that are actually implementing programs, as would be expected from localization. The other issue was the review as well as selection criteria for partners, and the need to have an opportunity to provide some kind of protections for local partners so that they can be selected. And this is again an area that often is perceived differently in terms of the mechanisms of how to provide these protections for local partners. It might not necessarily mean that it's lowering the quality, but rather the criteria that's used. For example, there are certain critical components that are really important in implementation of programs. For example, the experience as well as local knowledge be embedded within these provisions to the extent that they might provide protections or advantage to the local partners without necessarily hurting the quality of the programs. Then the other issue is recognizing and allowing for more gradual improvements as well as changes in a systemic way over time, but also deliberately investing in efforts to be able to achieve the required growth and improvements within the institutions so that we can achieve good results without necessarily compromising over time the issues around the fiduciary risks and compliance as would be expected. This requires flexibility and support, especially to the first-time grant recipients, if we are to expand the involvement of the local partners, especially the smallest organizations based within the communities. Next, please. The other issue is the engagement as well as involvement. When we look at the origins of some of these movements, the partners that we interviewed did not necessarily feel there was always involvement as well as engagement of the local partners all across the board. And the voices were towards involving both the South as well as the North partners in these definitions and the processes of how these movements as well as efforts to decolonize or localize should happen. So this is something that came out across a number of interviews that we had as well. And then there is the issues around mechanisms to track how the partnerships work when we have relationships between prime as well as sub-recipients of programs, having a mechanism or tools to be able to track how the decision-making is done and the pair relations therein, allocation of funding, sharing of credit for the outputs from the implementation of projects, among others. So the need for us to be able to evolve and have some tools and mechanism for monitoring this and getting feedback so that we can continuously improve and enhance equity within partnership. Now, the other issue is being able to leverage these concepts as noted by Allysha and the synergies therein for us to be able to shift the power to the local institutions, but also to the local communities overall, and to have them engaged and involved in the implementation, in setting priorities, as well as being able to measure the success of the programs that we implement. And this is really important in terms of also making sure that we recognize that there's local expertise and local knowledge that is important in terms of driving impact for the programs. Next, please. The other issue here to note is that partnerships really require an investment and engagement over time to be able to build and even through this very process of working on this concept, eventually the proposal and the data collection up to the white paper that we developed jointly. This was really a step-by-step process, starting with the FHI R4S team, reaching out to us at Macquarie and eventually our partners at EVIDAF, and then getting us together to work with support from the funding that we got from the USAID. So it was a process indeed. That's clearly an example of what it takes to build partnerships. We don't always factor this into planning programs, and sometimes we expect that they should move faster. But the process of engaging and having this happen in a manner that everyone's voice matters and counts is one that perhaps we need to plan for. And then also the other issue that emerged from the processes, rather from the views of the partners that we policies and there's do's and don'ts that eventually make their way into the contracts that we have with sub-partners come sometimes with inherently restrictive provisions to the partners that we work with across a number of areas, inequitable overhead costs, expectations around deliverables, and issues of authorship. There are branding provisions that sometimes we embed within the contracts with sub-partners that sometimes come with a lot of challenges, even when we mean well and would like to have equity within the partnerships. Next, please. So the other issue that came up was young people. The engagement of young people in these partnerships, the voices around the young people not necessarily having a voice or engaged and involved as much. So beyond the institutions, north and south, and the people that are involved, the young people in particular might not necessarily have a voice and an opportunity to have their views heard, but also to receive the recognition for their participation and contribution. And this extends to a number of issues, including authorship, and being able to present, you know, like we are sharing with you today, and I'm happy that Amandari is here with us and able to take credit for her contribution. These are some of the voices we had from some of our young people in terms of how they might actually be excluded from authorship, making presentations at conferences, and all the credit that comes with the work that we do. So we need to be quite deliberate about these issues and creating an environment where the people that participate can be able to voice their views, and we learn from these experiences and address the emerging bottlenecks in the partnerships. Next, please. So again, like I noted earlier, this was a process, a fairly long process of engagement, starting with the FHI team leading the R4S consortium, engaging with us at Makerere, and in our partners at EVIDAF, and engaging with the USID team to get support for this work, which came to us directly as the partners to implement and work together jointly to collect this data and analyze it and eventually synthesize it into the white paper and the findings that we are sharing with you today. And we also did, especially along this process, engage on issues of it's clear and it's equitable, and there's an opportunity for colleagues that participated in this to also be part of the process, not only for the white paper, but also any publications that may arise from this. So it did take quite some time, but worthwhile in terms of building a strong partnership and making sure that we all work together with a common goal. I'll pass over this back to Allysha.
Thank you so much, Ruda. So, and to Amandari as well for walking us through. So as you can see, everyone, there were a lot of steps on the journey and a lot that we learned in the process. We wanted to share just some further reflections about the whole thing, and then invite it up for conversation. And I do actually see a question already been asked, so thank you for that. We will definitely get to it. One of the first reflections that we just wanted to circle back to was those connections between decolonization, localization, and DEIA. They can alienate folks. I can't tell you how many times in the last 3.5 years that I've been engaging in these concepts and doing this work that people say, well, you know, decolonization is not relevant. We're in the US. We only care about DEIA. And localization is not relevant to us because we're in the US. All of these power dynamics play themselves out in communities that experience marginalization, and that is communities of color globally, right? So those connections can alienate folks and make them uncomfortable. But what I would encourage you all to think about is, where does that discomfort actually come from? Oftentimes, the word decolonization in and of itself gives people pause. People almost have like a visceral reaction to it. And I would note that that's actually the movement that has been around the longest. And out of the three, out of discussion of localization, out of decolonization, and out of DEIA rather, decolonization is actually the one that originated in the global south. So you have to think about, where does that discomfort come from, and how do we use that productively without shutting off because of it? Second, our entire partnership with USAID, through FHI 360, with EVIDUF, with Makary, there was a lot of privilege involved, right? All of these are institutions who are pretty well resourced and equipped, very familiar with USAID and its processes. All of us are very well educated, English speaking. I mean, there's a lot of privilege we had to acknowledge in our ability to engage in this work. It doesn't mean we didn't do the work thoughtfully, but it meant we had to be very honest. And that's part of why we talk about positionality and why we're very candid about our worldviews. Third, we felt like it was really important for all of us to understand that all of us are actors in global health development, and whether we are comfortable with it or not, all of us can be both part of the problem and part of the solution. But we have to move away from problematizing people and more problematizing the structures. And we have to understand that this work is not about a zero-sum outcome. It's not simply, if I give up power, I now have no place to be. Or if I give up power, that means that the work that I've done is irrelevant, or everything is about me and the power that I hold. Sharing power is often the first step to shifting power, right? So a zero-sum game is really not the way to think about this. And then lastly, we really wanted our young global health professionals, our young people, to understand that service learning opportunities, and some of our colleagues who wrote this paper, they were students, were in service learning opportunities. And sometimes, even though you have the best of intentions in your service learning opportunity, you might be reinforcing power structures. And so reflecting on positionality, doing the work of decolonizing, understanding how to ask thoughtful questions, how to maximize benefits to the communities in which you work, understanding that not every role is yours to take, and understanding that creating a fostered culture of learning and being okay with being wrong is really important. So with that, we are going to open it up to questions and conversation. Now, I see a couple of questions in the chat. And so I want to first ask Amandardi to please answer a question. I promise you we will get to the two that are asked. But as Rhoda touched on, we felt it was really important for young people to have a voice. And Amandardi was one of several who were a part of this process. For you, Amandardi, as a young global health professional, what do you feel like you learned from this process? What do you feel like you take forward into your career?
I feel like, I think the process of like writing a paper with a group of people is something that I had never experienced, but I know is a big part of academia and research and all of that. And the discussions around authorship were very interesting to me because, again, I have heard about, you know, the drama that surrounds who was first author and et cetera. And the fact that we talked about it upfront, and that was one thing where I was like, you know, I'm a student, I genuinely don't know what is going on, so I'm going to sit back and listen. And was it was really nice that I think you said, and Amadari should be, you know, on this authorship list as well, because I didn't feel like, you know, as a student, I had the power to be like, hello, I should be on here as well. But I think just in general, talking about it up front eliminated some of that, you know, tension. Not that it wasn't there, but I think it was also really interesting when we had authorship conversations with USAID in the room and not. seeing how the dynamics changed based on the power dynamics in the room or in the virtual room. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think you're absolutely right. Those power dynamics, they're always there, everyone. We can't pretend that they aren't. And I know for me, I absolutely recognize the difference when our colleagues were in their room versus not. And it wasn't to say that it was like, stifling versus not, but a conversation amongst the folks who are not funders and not the source of the funding. Of course, it's going to feel different. And there had to be space for both. There had to be space for us to really reflect on what authorship reflects who really did the work and what is everyone comfortable with. And also, how do we feel about USCID folks being co-authors as well? That does give a different impression, but at the same time, our group had to discuss how we felt about that, who makes sense as an author, where should they be in the authors list? And we needed to do that to have honest conversation with them in the room too. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'd like to pose our first question to Dr. Wanyenze. So Christina asks, I'm curious what funding organizations embody what we found through this work. For instance, are there model organizations that explicitly build in flexibility for first-time awardees to create infrastructure that works for them? Rhoda, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, thanks, Allysha. I think we find that several funding organizations are beginning to make an effort to pay attention to some of these things. We are not yet where we ought to be, but I have personally had an experience with one grant where the funder, we were not necessarily a first-time funding, grant recipient, but we still have quite a number of constraints around growing our infrastructure and systems. And this particular grant allowed us a fairly significant percentage. I think it was about 35%, which is very rare. Most of the grants that we get externally have very different overhead costs. For example, for us, you can hardly go beyond 8%. If it's a 10%, then you're very lucky for it. Even when the prime grant recipient is getting about 50%, you can hardly get to 10%. But this particular grant allowed us to explore the gaps that we had and be able to address them. And there was an adjustment of that, the overhead costs specifically to focus on areas where we had challenges, for example, to expand our infrastructure so that we can have better space to work in for training. And so this is something we rarely see, because for most of the grants, you're given money for activities. The assumption is you already have space, you already have the systems in place, and you can manage with that, which is really constraining. And in fact, sometimes inherently makes it very difficult for us to grow, because there are not many institutions that can cope with very small overheads. We have recently had one, for example, where we were told a 5% was too high and we needed to get down to 3%. And I was wondering just how unfair it can get. So I would say in a broad sense that we are beginning to see some shifts, but we hope that more can be done in terms of having an inbuilt mechanism that allows us to even directly budget for improvements in our systems without necessarily having to struggle to embed that within very small overhead costs. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rhoda. So I see another question. I think it's directed to me. So it says, I had talked about the process of colonization being something we've experienced for a while. And Emma's question is, cultures and communications between different races are still very large. Would people finally be equitable when we are all mixed race? Thank you for this question, Emma. The answer is no, and I'll tell you why. First off, I don't think any of us can ever expect to be in a situation where all societies are all mixed race. One reason why is because of all these power structures that we're talking about, racism and colonialism and sexism and ethnocentrism, etc. So there really isn't a way for us to ever envision that space, number one. And number two, I'll say from my own experience, I am Caribbean American, right? So my entire family is 100% Jamaican. They are not all 100% Black. And I can tell you, as someone who is from a mixed race family, all of the power structures are still there. We talk about skin tone and hair texture and all of these things that ultimately are still relics of racism and internalized racism and classism and who has this fancy degree and who didn't and who speaks with an American accent and who doesn't. All of those power systems and structures do not change and disappear solely when we have more diversity. It sometimes helps. It will not change all of the power systems and structures. Thank you for that question. I see a note from Anthony that says most innovations go unfunded and the world ends up losing good brains. That often does happen, absolutely. I see another question from Professor Stewart, thank you, that says, you note that INGOs with offices in country are not local partners. Could you share more about what is a local partner? For example, a remote government health clinic could be a local partner. At the same time, they're a government agent, but within the hierarchy within country. I would note, Professor Stewart, for myself and Amandardi and Rhoda are also absolutely welcome to answer. I think for me, the difference is where was that organization founded and by whom for what intention? So if it was not founded by folks who are indigenous to that community, if it is not staffed entirely by folks from that community, if their intention, their mandate, their vision statement is not specifically around the needs, priorities, et cetera, of that community, that should not be deemed as a local partner. At best, it's a local office of a global North partner. Rhoda, Amandar, did you all have any thoughts you'd like to share on that question?
Yeah, I think yes, you did define that, but I think for me that question also clearly brings out the need to have better definitions and perhaps to engage stakeholders in refining these definitions, because we have experienced situations where you have international NGOs that will know there is a call for applications coming up, and we need to quickly get a registration so that we are eligible, or otherwise begin to make very quick adjustments just to meet the criteria. And I think those are some of the issues that can be anticipated and clarified in the definition so that it can reach the targeted local institutions. Yeah, so it does raise the and perhaps emphasize more why we need to engage around these issues. Who are we targeting and why, and how can we define that better so that we can get to the targeted institution or community?
Thank you for that, Rhoda. Amandar, do you have any thoughts? What makes somebody local? What are your thoughts?
I don't know that I have anything to add other than what I think you guys covered it pretty well.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I see another comment from Darla who says, just to note, there are some resources to support those interested in this work. Thank you, Darla. So Darla is noting the Association of International Education Administrators. They've got a thematic forum and annual conference, and they're headquartered in Durham. Thank you so much. So if folks want to make sure they take a note or look at Darla's chat comment, then that can be a resource for folks who are interested in more information. I see another question from Darla that says, intercultural competence plays a foundational role in partnerships and relationships. I'm curious how this project addresses that. I'll separate out a couple of pieces that I think you're speaking to, Darla, because I think there's a few pieces. First off, the project itself was R4S, which is Research for Scalable Solutions. That's a little bit separate than those of us who did the work of the white paper. So I'd like to go ahead and make sure that I note that with regard to our group, we talked quite a bit, not about intercultural competence, because I think even that has westernized definitions and metrics around it. But what we did do when we had our positionality statement discussions and why they were necessary, we did talk about why it is that we felt the need for discussion of language and why the need was there to create a glossary of problematic terms. And we've spent quite a bit of time amongst our groups, even reflecting on what the language means for us. I remember having conversations with Rhoda and others about those visceral reactions we ourselves had to some of these terms. Another thing we did that has everything to do with that kind of cross-cultural communication and understanding is we invited our colleagues who participated in interviews to review and edit our document. So we invited them to interrogate the language, interrogate the findings and how we communicated them. And we were very mindful that we were asking for people from very different cultural contexts and backgrounds to look at this paper and piece and try to consume its findings and what it meant. And of course, we had to make changes accordingly. So those are some of the places we engaged in what I would call cross-cultural communication and real understanding, and why the transparency piece is so, so important. Thank you. Andy has a question. Andy asks, are there any particular strategies for calling out / working with overarching organizations on existing policies rooted in distrust of non-US organizations, i.e. inequitable overhead, proof of legitimacy, extra financial scrutiny, and delays? So there's a lot of pieces to Andy's question. I'll invite my colleagues, Rhoda or Amandari, do either of you want to take a stab at Andy's question?
Yeah, so I'll make some comments around this. I think it's an area that is still quite challenging, because we don't necessarily have mechanisms for even just having checklists for what some of these common. I really do hope that this paper can add value in that respect, and I hope we can move towards generating checklists, generating opportunities to learn and grow in terms of how to develop policies that are equitable, because we talk about many things, but we rarely talk about the policies. And even when we try to engage and build relationships, we often do not think about the policies. And quite often you have really a good relationship and want something to happen differently, perhaps, but then you said, this is our institutional policy, so I can't do anything about it. So you carry on to do something that's completely contradictory to the good relationships that we'd like to partner to create. But I also think that funding agencies have such a big role in terms of enforcing this, and it can be embedded within the funding requirements and review of applications for applying, selected grantees to describe the level of equity that is built within their policies in specific areas, including checklists that can be used. And if the policies are not found to be conducive, that they can be required to revise them if they are to receive the funding. So I think the funding agencies do have a role, but also institutions do have a role to reflect and be able to make their policies more equitable.
Thank you for that, Rhoda.
Allysha, someone in the room has a question.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, I don't know if I'm loud enough. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi.
Hi, I'm Vivian. And thank you so much for this very important discussion. So we spoke a bit on youth and young people engagement. So I'm curious to know what are some suggestions you may have on how students can begin engaging in DEIA, decolonizing, and localization praxis when our capacity, our funding, our abilities are pretty limited right now. Yeah, so just want to know your thoughts and any suggestions.
Thank you for that. So was it Vivian? Was that your name?
Yes.
Thank you for that question, Vivian. I will absolutely answer it. Really quickly, though, I want to just go back to a couple comments in the chat that I just saw. I always want to be mindful of getting to everyone's question. So I didn't forget about you, Vivian. I will get to your question. Thank you so much. I noted from Emma that Emma says that it sounds like we use human-centered design. I am going to ask everyone, do we want to always identify with something we've seen before, or are we identifying with global north concepts? And I say that because no, what we did was not exactly human-centered design. What we did was something that was very much rooted in the needs and the nature of the partnership that we had, the fact that everyone had incredible existing areas of expertise that we wanted to honor, and almost all of us on this project are multilingual and understood full well we had to come to shared understanding of language in order to do this work. Some of them you might call principles of human-centered design, but not everything can be defined with the global north concept, right? I see another question or a comment from Darla that says, thanks for the response, and that it's important to understand what perspectives look like from beyond global north. For example, UNESCO has published a piece called Taking It Local. So that's another piece where I'd be curious, Darla, how they actually did engage folks who are local and what it means and what their definition of locally led development and localization looks like. I can't say enough how important that definition piece is. Now to get to Vivian's question. Thank you for your patience, Vivian. I have given a couple of talks where I've tried to walk through with the MSCH and global health students, what are things that are actually in your sphere of influence, things that you can do? First and foremost, educating yourself on these topics, it's not a short-term thing. It is long-term. It takes time to understand these concepts, to understand your positionality around them, reflecting on decoloniality, reflecting on, are you actually the right person to take action? Is there someone else who might actually be better equipped? As I said, I think a couple nights ago, and I've said in the past, not every message can be carried by every messenger. So as a global health professional who's emerging and is really getting experience, that process of understanding how much self-education you have to engage in continually, understanding what issues you're actually seeing play out, understanding what are real approaches to addressing them that are rooted in decoloniality and DEIA and true localization, and then reflecting on whether you're actually the right person to do it. Those are the processes that I think young people have to learn and understand. I won't sit here and tell you that I am so far in age past all of you. I have to constantly learn those things. I have to constantly remind myself, I cannot fix everything. I have to start somewhere. And my own self-education and how I go about my work personally, the way I treat folks, the way I advocate for them, the way I ask questions on their behalf, the way I speak for the folks that were never going to be in the rooms that I'm going to be in, that's a huge place to start. And I want to note, and a lot of the questions I've gotten from students, it's always, how can we push back and how do we fight? I would really ask you to reflect on, is it a fight you actually can take on? Is it a fight that you can see through often when you're in transient positions? That understanding of how you're coming into the space, what you can accomplish, why you want to accomplish it, and who is actually best to do it. That's where I would encourage you all to start and understand not every fight is one you can fight. And we do have to problematize the systems, not any one person. Rhoda or Amandari, do you all want to make any comment with regard to where can young people start?
You did it well, Allysha. No additional comment.
Okay. As the resident young person, I'll just chime in a little bit and say I definitely agree with everything Allysha said about reflecting. I feel like when I was in undergrad, there was, I don't know, a ton of stuff around me in the global health and development like classes that were like, you know, go volunteer in this developing country and go you know, help these people in the global south. And none of that really sat right with me, but it took until like many years after I was done with undergrad to have the language to like be able to articulate why that was problematic. And I still feel like I'm learning how to articulate what is, you know, what is wrong with systems like this and how we can do them better. And I think that one of the pieces of advice I have is question everything you hear in global health classes, because you know how things are measured, how we talk about certain things is all rooted in these systems of colonization. And it's not always that, you know, you need to be fighting your professors who may have said something problematic, but think about it and go and do some more and go and do some more research, which is where I am still at.
Thank you for that, Amandardi. I think that's a really honest, candid answer. There's a constant self-education and reflection piece. We're very quick to want to take action. We need to understand what action needs to be taken and why, and even why we want to take that action before we can do any of it meaningfully. It's not a slow process. And that's my honest, candid journey speaking when I answer the question that way. I see another question in the chat that says, how might US-based organizations consciously incorporate practices within the DEIA space that recognize the impact of colonization on the communities they partner with and their own staff members, including organizations that function primarily within the US? And there's an additional comment. Often, larger organizations may focus DEIA work on addressing disparities based on race, but don't appear to understand their position within a space inherently influenced and affected by histories of colonialism. Thank you for that. I have a couple of comments. I'll invite my colleagues Rhoda or Amandardi. Do you all want to take a stab to start at that? How might US-based organizations more consciously incorporate colonization and decolonizing into their DEI work?
I would say engage the communities, and engage with an open space where they can voice their views and share experiences. I think that brings a richness to the approaches towards addressing some of these issues. Some of them are quite subtle, and it's very difficult to pick them unless you engage in a free space where we can get different perspectives. And I would say that we all need to engage, we all need to learn. And our institutions in the South too need to learn, because this is an issue of power relations. It's not just about US-based versus, based in Africa or whichever other, region. It's about power, and sometimes it's Africa to Africa, and sometimes it's our bigger institutions within Africa to the communities that we work with. And sometimes it's the more established, professionals versus the young people that we work with. So I think it's all about engaging and having different voices come through.
I have very little to add. Thank you so much, Rhoda. The one thing I'd like to add is that a lot of organizations that are based in the global north, because this is not just a US question, as Rhoda said, but a lot of organizations that are either based in the global north or were founded in the global north, they bring in DEI consultants. If those consultants are not also understanding of the larger global shared history we have, if they are not consultants with relevant lived experience and expertise, if there aren't specific metrics that go far beyond just diversity, you're not doing any of the practices that are either DEIA or any of these other things. Another thing I've seen quite a bit is that even though DEI consultants are often brought in to an organization, localization policies and practices are not always something that people will get outside influence and kind of perspectives on. If that's not being done, then that's not really the work of localization either, because the way that you design your principles and policies, if the purpose is to localize, to encourage diversity, equity, inclusion, none of those are things you could tackle alone. There has to be engagement with stakeholders, relevant communities, who we call beneficiaries, but absolutely that's not the term. It's the communities in which you're working. It's that, it's to partner in a really candid space and to be okay with being wrong. Popworks Africa by Stephanie, I think Kamuzu, is also a really fantastic training that I highly recommend. And I think that that's another thing too. There needs to be a lot more education about what these structures really mean to each other for any of it to really be done in a comprehensive or transformative way. So I think we have just a couple of minutes less. I am happy to invite any final question from the audience before we close. Any other burning comments? I see some thank yous in the chat. I see Roger says, don't forget Peace Corps as a possibility for starting in global health. I see some thank you comments. So Hannah asked, what about other problematic terms? We do have a document of those. I can share the link with the organizers and you all can take a look. There's quite a few of them. I see also recommendations on essential reading. Yes, any of my colleagues who have my talks that I have given, there are always recommended resources in there. You can also feel free to reach out to me, but definitely I have many resources that we would recommend from our partnership. I don't have the link for the chat with me. I will give the link to the organizers. I see that question from Lisa so that we can share it with you all. I believe capacity building is something people talked about. Again, I would refer you all to the glossary of terms and you can feel free to use them, cite them as you see necessary. I see a thank you from Derek in the chat as well on needing more understanding on decolonization. I'm glad to hear that. I think all of us are in that constant learning place. These are some of those suggested resources, everyone. I told you, anywhere I go, I've got links and resources that I want people to take a look at, please. So we will make sure that these slides are shared out. Thank you so much to my colleagues for presenting. I've put myself and Rhoda as contact people if folks have questions or comments. I hope that's okay, Rhoda. Thank you in advance. But like I said, we will share resources and thank you all so much for this session. We really, really appreciate your engagement. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.